Welcome to Heartbreaker, your love radio.
David parked the car in the driveway, grabbed a bouquet of flowers from the passenger seat, and walked into the house. The aroma of home-cooked food greeted him, and he smiled, eager to surprise Alice. As he opened the F-David door, he saw Alexander Armstavage sitting on the living room sofa. Alexander was a tall man with a confident smile, who immediately stood up upon seeing David enter. "You must be David." "Nice to meet you," Alexander said, extending his hand. David shook his hand, feeling the firmness of his grip. "Likewise, Alexander. I've heard a lot about you." David made his way to the kitchen, where Alice was finishing up the dinner preparations. "Flowers for my favorite woman," he said, handing her the bouquet. Alice smiled and gave him a quick kiss. "Thank you, love. You're the best." Returning to the living room, David joined Alexander. "So, Alexander, how are you adjusting to the city?" "Seattle is fantastic. I'm still getting used to the weather, but the team at work has been amazing." "Especially Alice," Alexander replied, giving Alice an appreciative look as she entered the room. Alice smiled politely and sat down next to David. "Alexander has been a great boss so far. I'm really enjoying working with him." "I'm glad to hear that," David said, trying to hide any discomfort in his voice. "And what are your hobbies, Alexander?" "Well, I love mountain climbing and I'm a big fan of extreme sports." "I think Seattle is the perfect place for that," Alexander responded, his tone confident. "That's interesting. I also enjoy outdoor activities, but nothing that extreme," David said, trying to find common ground. The conversation continued, with Alice and Alexander discussing work projects, while David listened attentively. He noticed how easily Alexander moved and spoke, his unwavering confidence. Something about him bothered David, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. "So, Alexander," David began, changing the subject, "have you always worked in the tech industry?" "Yes, pretty much my whole life. I've always been fascinated by innovation and the potential to transform the world with technology." "And you, David? What do you do?" "I'm a security consultant. I spent many years in the military before retiring and settling down here with Alice," David replied with a slight smile. "That's amazing. It must have been an intense career," Alexander commented, seemingly interested. "It certainly was. But now, I'm happy to have a quieter job and to be able to spend more time with my family," David said, casting a loving glance at Alice. The conversation continued, but the tension in the air was palpable. David couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He decided that, for now, he would keep his suspicions to himself, but remain vigilant for any signs of trouble. The evening continued peacefully in David and Alice's house. Sitting in the living room, the three of them chatted about various topics. Alice was visibly pleased with the presence of her new boss, while David, still trying to adjust to the situation, maintained a polite smile. "So, Alexander, besides extreme sports, do you have any other hobbies?" David asked, trying to keep the conversation light. Alexander, with his usual confident smile, replied, "I love traveling and experiencing new cultures. It's always an adventure." "And you, David? What do you like to do in your free time?" David hesitated for a moment. "I enjoy outdoor activities and, of course, spending time with Alice. I also like reading about military history and practicing target shooting occasionally." Suddenly, as Alice went to the kitchen to check if dinner was ready, Alexander changed the subject abruptly, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "David, I want to be direct with you. I intend to sleep with your wife. And I would like you to watch." The ensuing silence was deafening. David maintained an impressive outward calm, though he felt a growing fury inside. "Interesting proposal," David said, his voice firm and controlled. "Why don't we go to my man cave to discuss this?" Alexander, not perceiving the hidden tension in David's voice, accepted the invitation with a smile, thinking he had managed to dominate the situation. The two men stood up, and David led Alexander to the basement. As they descended the stairs, the atmosphere changed drastically. David's man cave was a sanctuary of his glory days and battles. Every trophy, weapon, and medal told a story, and the envy Davidment was heavy, laden with memories and a sense of latent danger. David took a large hunting knife from a shelf, holding it firmly as he looked at Alexander. "You see these medals?" David said, pointing to the wall. "They're not just for decoration. Each one represents a mission, a moment when my life and the lives of others were on the line." Alexander swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on the sharp blade of the knife. I didn't mean to offend, David. It was a stupid comment." David stepped closer, his eyes locked on Alexander. "You'd better not have offended. Because I take my family's safety very seriously." The tension in the air was palpable. David continued, his voice low and controlled. "I was a military sniper. I know exactly how to deal with threats. Do you think you can come here, disrespect my home and my wife, and walk away unscathed?" Alexander began to realize the real danger of the situation. "Look, David, I'm really sorry. I didn't mean to cause any trouble." David raised the knife, the blade reflecting the soft light of the basement. "Trouble you have already caused. And now, you're going to understand that you can't play with my family's safety." Alexander took a step back, trying to stay calm. "Please, David. Let's resolve this in a civilized manner. I promise I'll never do anything like this again." "Civilized manner," David repeated, with a tone of disdain. "You've already crossed the line of what is civilized." Alexander was sweating now, fear evident in his eyes. "I get it, David. I really do. Just, please, lower the knife." David stood still for a moment, considering his options. He slowly lowered the knife, but his gaze remained cold and threatening. "You're lucky I'm not the man I was on the battlefield. But that doesn't mean you're free from consequences." David took a step back, still keeping Alexander under his severe gaze. "Now, you're going to go back upstairs and behave. If I sense any sign of disrespect, you'll wish you'd never crossed my path." Alexander nodded quickly, relieved to see the knife lowered. "Thank you, David. I promise I'll behave." David pointed to the stairs. "Go up." Alexander obeyed, climbing the stairs quickly, with David close behind. When they reached the dining room, Alice was waiting, concern evident on her face. She looked from David to Alexander, trying to understand what had happened. "Everything's fine, love," David said, trying to reassure her. Alice looked at David, still trying to process the situation. "Are you sure, David?" "I am," David replied firmly. "Let's continue with dinner." The atmosphere in the dining room seemed normal, but tension hung in the air. The table was beautifully set by Alice, with refined dishes and gleaming cutlery. The aroma of the delicious meal filled the room, trying to mask the charged emotions. David, Alice, and Alexander sat at the table, and the initial conversation revolved around trivial topics. Alice tried to maintain normalcy, while Alexander avoided David's gaze. David's words echoed in Alexander's mind, and he knew he was treading on dangerous ground. As they served the food, David decided it was time to bring the truth to light. He looked directly at Alice, his tone calm but firm. "Alice, Alexander has something to say." Alexander swallowed hard, his face paling. Before he could find the words, David continued. "He said he wants to sleep with you and that I should watch." Alice's fork clattered loudly onto her plate. She looked at Alexander, incredulous and hurt. "What? Is this true?" Alexander tried to stammer out an excuse, but the words wouldn't come. He was trapped between David's steady gaze and Alice's disappointment. David, maintaining his exterior calm, took a digital recording from his pocket and placed it on the table. He pressed play, and Alexander's voice echoed through the room, clear and unmistakable, revealing his indecent intentions. "He is not who he seems to be, Alice." The recording ended, leaving a heavy silence in the air. Alice was shocked, her eyes filling with tears. "How could you, Alexander? I thought—" Alexander, realizing he was completely exposed, tried to defend himself. "Alice, it was a terrible mistake. I was drunk on arrogance and— I'm so sorry." "That's not enough," David said, his voice cold. "You came into our home, disrespected us in an unacceptable way. I will not tolerate this behavior." Alice, still processing the revelation, looked at David. "What are we going to do, David?" "That's not all," David continued, staring intently at Alexander, who was standing, ready to leave. "I did my research. You were fired from your previous company after being sued for sexual harassment." Alice looked at David, incredulous. "What else are you hiding, Alexander?" Alexander tried to defend himself, but the pressure was mounting. "That was a misunderstanding." David didn't let him finish. "Your ex-wife planned a punishment, but you managed to avoid it. But here, you won't escape so easily." Alice was visibly shaken. "Alexander, how could you lie to all of us?" Alexander shook his head, trying to find the right words. "Alice, I tried to leave that past behind. That doesn't define who I am now." "It doesn't define you," David retorted, his voice cold. "Do you think you can just erase your past actions? You caused pain and suffering to people who trusted you." Alice shook her head, disappointed. "I thought you were different, Alexander. I thought I could trust you as a boss and a friend." "I've changed," Alexander insisted, his voice pleading for understanding. "I made mistakes, yes. But I'm trying to be a better person." "It doesn't look like it," David said, still impassive. "You came here with the intention of disrespecting my wife and our home. That shows you haven't changed at all." Alice looked at David, trying to process the enormity of the situation. "What are we going to do now?" David took a deep breath, keeping his gaze fixed on Alexander. "First, we're going to make sure he never has the chance to do something like this again. We'll expose what he did so others won't fall for his lies." Alexander started to sweat, panic setting in. "Please, David. I beg you. I've already lost so much. Don't make me lose more." David remained firm. "You should have thought about that before trying to manipulate us. Now, you'll have to deal with the consequences." "Alice and I thought we'd teach you a lesson," said David, his voice cold and calculated. "Something you'll never forget." Alexander began to sweat, his voice trembling with fear. "Please, I beg you. I'll change my behavior. I promise." Alice crossed her arms and looked directly at Alexander with disdain. "Do you think you can just walk away unscathed after what you did? Do you think an apology is enough?" Alexander shook his head desperately. "I am truly sorry. I didn't know what I was doing. Please, give me a chance." David stepped forward, his intimidating presence making Alexander step back. "A chance? You already had your chance and you blew it. Now, you're going to understand what it means to cross the line." David continued, his voice growing even more menacing. "During my time in the military, I learned various torture techniques. Things that would make you beg to have never been born. Maybe it's time to put some of those techniques to use." Alexander turned pale, his eyes wide with terror. "No, please. This will destroy me. I'll do anything to make up for it. Anything, David repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. Let's see if you mean that. Alice stepped closer to David, looking at Alexander sternly. You need to learn that your actions have consequences. And we're going to make sure you never forget that. David stared intently at Alexander. First, you're going to write a detailed confession of everything you've done, including your past actions and your intentions here. We'll keep this as insurance that you'll never bother us again. With trembling hands, Alexander took the pen and paper that Alice handed him and began to write. Each word seemed to weigh heavily as he described his actions and intentions. While Alexander wrote, David continued. But that's not all. We're going to make sure you feel the fear and humiliation you tried to impose on us. I could use you as a shooting target. My aim is impeccable, and I could shoot so close you'd feel the heat of the bullet without being hit. Just to see the fear in your eyes. Alexander stopped writing, looking up at David in terror. No, please, David, Alice. I've learned my lesson. I won't do anything like this ever again. I promise. David took a deep breath and signaled for Alexander to stand up. Now, strip down to your underwear. Alexander hesitated, but seeing the determined look on David and Alice's faces, he obeyed, stripping down with trembling hands until he was only in his underwear. Please, what more do you want from me? David took out his phone and snapped a photo of Alexander in that humiliating position. This photo and the recording of what you said will stay with us. If you ever disrespect anyone or act inappropriately again, we'll make sure everyone you know sees this. Alexander nodded again. I understand. Never again. I promise. We hope not, said Alice, still serious. Now get dressed and leave. And remember, we'll be watching. Alexander quickly dressed and almost ran out of the house. The door closed, and the dining room finally fell silent. David and Alice, still feeling the adrenaline from the confrontation, looked at each other, sharing a moment of laughter. Do you think he really learned his lesson? Alice asked, her voice softening a bit. Let's hope so, David replied, holding her hand. But if not, we'll be ready. The dining room was silent after Alexander's departure. Alice looked at David, her eyes reflecting a mixture of pleasure and desire. You always know how to protect me, she said softly, touching David's face tenderly. David smiled, holding her hand. I would do anything for you, Alice. Nothing is more important to me than your safety and happiness. She returned the smile, feeling a deep sense of gratitude and love. I love you, David. More than anything in this world. He leaned in and kissed her gently, their lips meeting in a gesture of affection and commitment. The kiss started soft but quickly turned into something more intense, reflecting the tension and adrenaline still coursing through their veins. His hands slid around her waist as she wrapped her arms around his neck. The intimacy between them grew as they moved through the dining room, their bodies drawing closer. David held Alice firmly but tenderly, his hands exploring every contour of her body. The passion between them was palpable, each touch and kiss reinforcing the connection they shared. Alice, David murmured, his voice husky with desire. I want you now. She looked at him, her eyes shining with the same intensity. Then have me, David. They gave themselves completely to each other, letting the intensity of the moment consume them. The dining room, which had been the stage for a dramatic scene, now transformed into a setting of desire. David lifted Alice and placed her on the dining table, his lips never leaving hers. She wrapped her legs around his waist, pulling him closer as her hands slid over his shoulders and arms. They moved together, their breaths quick and uneven, each movement filled with passion. The connection between them was deep and unwavering, and in that moment, nothing else mattered but the love they shared. When they finally pulled apart, Both were breathless, but completely satisfied. Alice looked at David, a smile of pure happiness on her face. "I love you, David. More than anything." David returned the smile, his eyes shining with love. "I love you too, Alice. And I always will." They stayed together in the dining room, savoring the peace and tranquility they had finally achieved. Meanwhile, the night in Seattle was pierced by the sound of Alexander's car speeding through the streets. He drove aimlessly, trying to escape the humiliation and fear consuming him. Alexander gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing with recent events. He could still feel David's cold stare, Alice's sternness, and the terror of the threats he had faced. Each turn of the road seemed to reflect the internal turmoil he felt. Stopping the car in an empty parking lot, Alexander rested his head against the steering wheel, trying to regain his composure. "How could I be so stupid?" Alexander murmured to himself, feeling the weight of his actions. He knew he had crossed a line he should never have crossed, and now he was paying the price for his arrogance and disrespect.